Hello there, and welcome to this quiet corner where time stretches long and wonder moves slowly. Tonight, we're not staying in the present moment. We're travelling backward, far backward, to a time when Earth wore a completely different face, a time when the very air you breathe would have been alien to your lungs, when the continents themselves were arranged like puzzle pieces from another box entirely. This is the story of the Mesozoic Era, and if you've ever looked at a world map and wondered why the continents seem to fit together like broken fragments of something once whole, tonight you'll understand why. Imagine for a moment that you could step outside your door tomorrow morning and find yourself standing not on the familiar ground you know, but on a planet where massive reptiles the size of school buses wade through shallow, warm seas that stretch from what we now call Kansas all the way to the Arctic Circle, where the air shimmers with humidity and the scent of unfamiliar flowers that are just beginning their first tentative experiments with colour and fragrance, where the nights echo not with the calls of owls or crickets, but with sounds no human ear has ever heard. Sounds from a world that existed for over 180 million years, yet feels as distant and dreamlike as another planet entirely. The Mesozoic Era, spanning from roughly 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago, was Earth's middle chapter, not the beginning of life's story, but not its current form either. It was a time of transformation so profound that by its end, our planet had reinvented itself completely. The continents had danced across the globe, the climate had swung from desert extremes to tropical abundance, and life itself had written some of its most ambitious chapters. But here's what makes this era so quietly extraordinary. It wasn't just about the dinosaurs, though they certainly played starring roles. It was about a planet learning to be generous, learning to support not just life, but an abundance of life, so rich and varied that it makes our modern world seem almost conservative by comparison. During the Mesozoic, Earth experimented. It tried out new forms, new systems, new ways of being alive that had never existed before, and in many cases would never exist again. Every great story begins with an ending, and the Mesozoic Era opened with one of the most profound endings our planet has ever witnessed. The transition from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic wasn't gradual or gentle. It was marked by what scientists call the Great Dying, an extinction event so thorough that it eliminated up to 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. Imagine Earth as a vast library, and suddenly 9 out of every 10 books simply vanish. But here's what's remarkable about life, and perhaps about existence itself. It doesn't interpret catastrophe as an ending. It sees it as a clearing, a blank canvas, an invitation to try something entirely new. The survivors of this great extinction, the resilient few percent that clung to existence, found themselves inheritors of an almost empty world. And what they did with that inheritance would reshape the very definition of what it means to be alive on Earth. The early Triassic period, the first chapter of the Mesozoic, began around 252 million years ago, with a planet that would have seemed both familiar and utterly alien to modern eyes. Familiar because the fundamental forces were the same. Gravity still pulled, water still flowed, the sun still rose and set. But alien because the stage upon which all of this played out was arranged so differently that it might as well have been another world entirely. At this time, all of Earth's land masses were still fused together in a single massive supercontinent called Pangea. Picture it, one enormous landmass stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single, vast ocean called Panthalassa. No Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific as we know it today. Just one continent and one sea, creating a planet where you could theoretically walk from what would one day be New York to what would one day be Beijing without ever setting foot in a boat. But this continental arrangement came with consequences that rippled through every aspect of life. The interior of Pangea was far from any ocean, creating some of the most extreme continental climates Earth has ever experienced. summers that baked the land with temperatures that would challenge modern desert dwellers, winters that brought cold so severe that vast regions became temporarily uninhabitable. Without the moderating influence of nearby oceans, the heart of Pangea swung between extremes that make our modern weather patterns seem gentle by comparison. Yet along the edges of this supercontinent, where the land met the sea, conditions were different. Tropical belts wrapped around Pangea's equatorial regions like green ribbons, creating environments where early life could not just survive, but begin to flourish again. These coastal regions became nurseries for the evolutionary experiments that would define the next 180 million years. The air itself during the early Triassic was different from what we breathe today. Oxygen levels were lower, creating an atmosphere that would leave modern humans gasping for breath, but carbon dioxide levels were higher, creating a greenhouse effect that wrapped the planet in warmth. This wasn't the gradual warming we discuss in modern climate conversations. This was a planet running a fever, still recovering from the trauma of the Great Extinction, still finding its new equilibrium. It was in this recovering world that the first dinosaurs took their tentative steps. Not the massive, thunderous giants that would later dominate the landscape, but small agile creatures many no larger than modern chickens. They moved through a world that was still largely ruled by other reptiles, creatures with names like Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus, animals that bore the distinctive, sail-like fins on their backs that may have helped them regulate their body temperature in a world of climate extremes. These early dinosaurs were evolutionary experiments, testing new approaches to survival in a world that was itself experimenting with new forms. Some walked on two legs, developing the upright posture that would eventually lead to the massive predators of later eras. Others remained quadrupedal but began developing the long necks and specialized teeth that would allow their descendants to browse vegetation that no previous herbivore could reach. But the dinosaurs were not alone in their evolutionary ambitions. The early Triassic also saw the emergence of the first mammals, though they remained tiny shrew-like creatures that scurried through the undergrowth, their significance not yet apparent. These early mammals carried within their genes the potential for warm-bloodedness, for complex social behaviours, for the kind of intelligence that would one day look back across deep time and try to understand these very moments. The plant life of the early Triassic was dominated by gymnosperms, cone-bearing plants like cycads and early conifers. These weren't the flowering plants that colour our modern world with their blooms and fruits. Those revolutionary innovations were still millions of years in the future. Instead, the landscape was painted in more muted tones, greens and browns, with reproduction happening through wind-blown pollen and unadorned seeds. Yet even these early plant communities were laying the groundwork for changes that would transform Earth's entire biosphere. They were learning to live in the new climate conditions, developing new strategies for water conservation in the arid interiors, and new ways to capture and use the abundant atmospheric carbon dioxide. These plant communities were writing the first chapters of what would become one of the most successful partnerships in Earth's history: the relationship between plant photosynthesis and animal metabolism. As the Triassic period progressed and gave way to the Jurassic, around 201 million years ago, Earth began to undergo one of the most significant geographical transformations in its history. Pangea, the supercontinent that had dominated the planet's surface for millions of years, began to crack apart. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but with the kind of slow, inexorable motion that characterizes geological time. This breakup wasn't simply a matter of land masses drifting apart. It was a fundamental reorganization of Earth's surface that would reshape climate patterns, ocean currents, and the very possibilities for life. As rifts opened between what would become North America and Africa, as new ocean basins began to form, the planet's weather systems had to reinvent themselves. The formation of new coastlines brought maritime influences deeper into continental interiors. The extreme climate swings that had characterized the Triassic began to moderate, as more land came under the influence of oceanic weather patterns. This moderation didn't happen overnight in human terms. It unfolded over millions of years, but it created conditions that allowed life to diversify in ways that had been impossible during the harsh extremes of the early Mesozoic. The Jurassic period, lasting from about 201 to 145 million years ago, became what many paleontologists consider the golden age of dinosaur evolution. The climate had settled into patterns of warmth and humidity that supported vast forests and extensive shallow seas. These weren't the deep oceans we know today, but warm, shallow bodies of water that created ideal conditions for marine life to flourish. In these warm Jurassic seas swam creatures that seemed to belong more to mythology than to natural history. Plesiosaurs with necks longer than their entire bodies, using those serpentine appendages to strike at fish with the speed of underwater lightning. Ichthyosaurs that had evolved to look remarkably like modern dolphins, despite being reptiles that had independently discovered the most efficient body plan for high-speed aquatic hunting. These weren't the ancestors of dolphins. They were parallel solutions to the same engineering challenge, proof that certain forms are so effective that evolution discovers them repeatedly. But perhaps the most significant development of the Jurassic was the emergence of the giant sauropod dinosaurs. Creatures like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus, animals so large that they challenge our understanding of what land-based life can achieve. These weren't just big animals, they were living skyscrapers, some reaching heights of 40 feet or more, with necks that allowed them to browse vegetation that no previous herbivore could reach. The existence of these giants tells us something profound about the Jurassic world. It wasn't just that the climate was favourable, it was that the entire ecosystem was reorganised around abundance. The plant communities were so productive, so rich in nutrients, that they could support animals whose daily caloric requirements would challenge the output of entire modern forests. This was a world where the fundamental equation between energy input and energy output had been rewritten to allow for forms of life that push against the very boundaries of what physics makes possible. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous period around 145 million years ago, Earth was about to undergo perhaps the most beautiful revolution in its history. This was when flowering plants, angiosperms, began their quiet but profound transformation of terrestrial life. Before this moment, reproduction in the plant world was largely a matter of wind and chance. Pollen drifted on air currents, sometimes finding its target, often not. Seeds fell where they might, with little control over their dispersal. But flowering plants introduced something entirely new to Earth's repertoire: partnership. They began to offer rewards to animals in exchange for reproductive services, nectar for energy, bright colours for attraction, fragrances to guide pollinators through the landscape. This wasn't just an innovation in plant reproduction, it was the birth of a new kind of relationship between different forms of life. The co-evolution that followed transformed both partners. Plants developed increasingly sophisticated strategies to attract and guide their animal partners. Flowers that opened only at certain times of day, matching the activity patterns of their preferred pollinators. Shapes that fit specific insects, like keys fitting locks. Colours that stood out against the green background of leaves, creating what may have been Earth's first deliberate use of advertising. Animals, in turn, evolved to take advantage of these new resources. The first bees appeared, developing specialised structures for collecting and carrying pollen. Early butterflies and moths began their own diversification, developing the long, coiled tongues that could reach deep into flower structures to access nectar. This wasn't just adaptation, it was the beginning of a conversation between different forms of life, conducted in the languages of colour, scent, and sweetness. The spread of flowering plants through the Cretaceous ecosystems was like the introduction of colour television to a world that had only known black and white. Suddenly, The landscape was painted with hues that had never existed before. Red flowers attracted birds, blue flowers attracted bees, white flowers opened at night to attract nocturnal pollinators. The world was becoming not just more diverse, but more beautiful in ways that seem almost designed for the aesthetic sense that wouldn't evolve until millions of years later. This flowering plant revolution coincided with rising sea levels that would reshape the very geography of the planet. During the late Cretaceous, oceans rose to heights not seen before or since in Earth's history, up to 200 meters higher than current levels. This wasn't just a matter of more water, it was a fundamental reorganization of the relationship between land and sea. Vast inland seas appeared where dry land had existed for millions of years. The Western Interior Seaway split North America down its middle, creating a warm, shallow sea that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. This wasn't just a geographic curiosity, it was a new kind of marine environment, one that would nurture forms of life that had never existed before and would never exist again. The story of the Mesozoic is far from complete. We've only just begun to explore the world of giants, the revolution of flowers, and the seas that covered continents. In our next journey through deep time, we'll dive deeper into these ancient oceans, meet the marine reptiles that ruled them, and discover how the breakup of continents created islands of evolution, where life experimented with forms so strange they seemed to belong in dreams, rather than in natural history. What secrets lie hidden in the fossil record of these vanished seas? What can we learn about our own planet's future by understanding its deep past? In the depths of the Western Interior Seaway, where Kansas now grows wheat under endless prairie skies, something extraordinary was stirring in waters so warm they might have reminded you of a tropical lagoon. But these weren't the shallow, crystal-clear waters of a modern coral reef. These were deeper, darker seas, their depths holding secrets that wouldn't see sunlight for over 80 million years. Picture, if you can, standing on what would one day be the Colorado Rockies, but looking east not across the Great Plains, but across a sea that stretched beyond the horizon. A sea where the water temperature rarely dropped below what we'd consider pleasantly warm for swimming, where the air above shimmered with humidity, and where the horizon blurred between water and sky in ways that made the world feel infinite. This seaway wasn't simply a larger version of modern inland lakes. It was a marine highway that connected the warm Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, creating a corridor for life forms to migrate between tropical and polar regions. But more than that, it was an evolutionary laboratory where life experimented with gigantism on a scale that makes even the largest modern marine animals seem modest by comparison. In these warm, shallow waters lived creatures that challenge our understanding of what's possible in marine ecosystems. Mosasaurs, marine lizards that had grown to lengths exceeding modern sperm whales, patrolled these seas with skulls alone, measuring 6 feet in length. These weren't simply large lizards that had learned to swim. They were purpose-built oceanic predators, their limbs transformed into powerful flippers, their tails developing the kind of vertical fins we associate with sharks and whales, despite being reptiles that had independently discovered these optimal aquatic forms. But perhaps even more remarkable were the plesiosaurs that shared these waters. Some, like Elasmosaurus, possessed necks containing over 70 vertebrae, creating appendages longer than the entire bodies of most modern whales. Imagine encountering such a creature, seeing what appears to be a sea serpent rising from the depths, only to realize that this impossibly long neck is attached to a body the size of a small ship, powered by flippers that could span the width of a modern highway lane. These weren't the random experiments of evolution run amok. Each of these creatures represented a refined solution to the challenges of life in the Western Interior Seaway. The long necks of plesiosaurs weren't just for show, they were precision fishing instruments, allowing these giants to strike at schools of fish from a distance while keeping their massive bodies motionless. Like living fishing rods operated by intelligence honed over millions of years, the seaway's ecosystem was layered with complexity that rivals anything in our modern oceans. At the surface, early seabirds like Hesperornis dove for fish with beaks full of teeth, their wings having evolved not for flight, but for underwater propulsion. These were diving specialists that had given up the sky to master the sea, their bodies streamlined for a life spent more underwater than above it. Below them, in the middle depths, schools of bony fish created moving silver clouds that attracted predators from every direction. Cephactinus, a fish that grew to lengths of 20 feet, cruised these waters like living torpedoes, their massive jaws capable of swallowing prey nearly half their own size. Fossil evidence shows us that these prehistoric fish sometimes bit off more than they could swallow quite literally, with specimens preserved in the act of choking on prey too large for even their enormous gullets. But what made these extraordinary ecosystems possible wasn't just the presence of water where we now find land. It was the climate system that Earth had developed during the Cretaceous, a system so different from our modern weather patterns that it might as well have operated under entirely different physical laws. The Earth of 100 million years ago was a greenhouse planet in the most literal sense. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were perhaps 5 times higher than our pre-industrial levels, creating a blanket of warmth that extended all the way to the poles. But this wasn't the catastrophic warming scenario we worry about today. This was a different kind of planet entirely, one where the fundamental relationship between atmosphere, ocean, and life had settled into patterns that could sustain themselves for tens of millions of years. There were no polar ice caps during much of the Cretaceous, where we now find the frozen landscapes of Antarctica and the Arctic Ocean. Cretaceous Earth supported temperate forests and relatively warm seas. Palm trees grew in Alaska. Crocodiles basked on beaches where polar bears now hunt seals. This wasn't a planet in crisis, it was a planet that had found a different equilibrium, one that happened to favour gigantism and abundance in ways our cooler modern world cannot match. The absence of ice caps meant that sea levels could rise to heights that seem almost incomprehensible today. At their peak, Cretaceous oceans stood 200 to 250 metres higher than current levels. To put this in perspective, if similar sea level rise occurred today, cities like New York, London, and Tokyo would lie under hundreds of feet of water. Entire countries would vanish beneath the waves. The very shape of our continents would become unrecognisable. But during the Cretaceous, this high sea level wasn't a disaster. It was simply the normal state of affairs. Life had adapted to a world where the boundary between land and sea was drawn very differently than it is today. Vast, shallow seas covered what are now the interiors of continents, creating marine environments unlike anything in our modern world. These epicontinental seas, as scientists call them, were neither fully oceanic nor truly coastal. They were something in between, and that intermediate nature made them incredibly productive. Nutrients from continental runoff mixed with marine waters to create conditions that could support food webs of extraordinary complexity and abundance. The climate that supported these systems was remarkably stable, at least on geological timescales. While our modern climate swings between ice ages and interglacial periods over cycles of tens of thousands of years, the Cretaceous greenhouse state persisted for over 50 million years. This stability allowed ecosystems to develop and refine themselves over timeframes that dwarf human civilization. Ocean currents during the Cretaceous flowed in patterns completely unlike those of today. Without polar ice to drive the kind of deep water circulation that characterizes our modern oceans, Cretaceous seas moved according to different rules. Warm water could flow freely from equator to pole, carrying heat and nutrients in ways that created marine environments at high latitudes that have no modern equivalent. While marine giants ruled the inland seas, an even more profound revolution was quietly transforming the terrestrial world. The evolution of flowering plants during the Cretaceous wasn't simply the addition of new species to existing ecosystems, it was a fundamental reorganization of how energy and nutrients moved through terrestrial environments. Before flowering plants, the plant world operated largely on the principle of abundance through waste. Conifers and other gymnosperms produced enormous quantities of pollen, casting it to the winds in the hope that some small fraction would reach its intended target. It was a strategy that worked, but it was inefficient in ways that limited how complex terrestrial ecosystems could become. Flowering plants introduced precision to this process. Instead of relying on random chance, they began to recruit animal partners to deliver pollen exactly where it needed to go. This partnership required flowering plants to invest energy in attracting and rewarding their animal partners, but the return on that investment was enormous. The co-evolution between flowering plants and their pollinators created feedback loops that drove both groups toward ever greater diversity and specialization. Plants evolved flowers with increasingly specific shapes, colors, and fragrances to attract particular pollinators. Animals evolved increasingly specialized structures and behaviors to access the resources that plants offered. This wasn't just an exchange of services, it was the birth of a new kind of ecosystem, one based on cooperation rather than simple competition. The success of flowering plants began to reshape entire landscapes, creating new niches for herbivores, new resources for pollinators, and new patterns of seasonal change that affected every aspect of terrestrial life. By the late Cretaceous, flowering plants had begun to dominate many terrestrial environments. Though conifers and other gymnosperms remained important components of most ecosystems, the world was becoming more colourful, more fragrant, and more seasonally dynamic as flowering plants introduced new rhythms of blooming, fruiting, and senescence. The rise of grasses during this period was particularly significant, though their full impact wouldn't be felt until much later in Earth's history. Early grasses were creating new kinds of open habitats, environments that would eventually give rise to the vast prairies and savannas that would characterize much of the Cenozoic era. As flowering plants were revolutionizing terrestrial ecosystems and marine reptiles were exploring the possibilities of gigantism in inland seas, the continents themselves continued their slow dance across Earth's surface. The breakup of Pangea, which had begun in the Triassic, was now well advanced, creating a world map that would have looked surprisingly familiar to modern eyes, though still distinctly different. South America and Africa were separating, creating the South Atlantic Ocean. India was beginning its long journey northward toward its eventual collision with Asia. Australia was still connected to Antarctica, but that connection was becoming increasingly tenuous. The North Atlantic was widening, gradually separating North America from Europe. These continental movements weren't just geographical curiosities, they were actively shaping climate and evolution in ways that would define the rest of Earth's history. As continents moved into new positions, they changed ocean current patterns, altered the distribution of heat around the globe, and created new barriers and connections between different regions. The isolation of different continental areas allowed evolution to proceed along different paths in different regions. Dinosaur faunas began to diverge as continental separation reduced the opportunities for migration between landmasses. South America developed its own distinctive dinosaur communities, as did Africa, North America, and Asia. This geographic isolation created what evolutionary biologists call natural experiments, situations where similar environmental challenges were faced by different groups of organisms in different parts of the world. The results of these experiments would show both the power of convergent evolution, where similar challenges produce similar solutions, and the role of of historical accident in shaping the course of evolutionary change. The changing positions of continents also affected the distribution of shallow seas and the patterns of sedimentation that would preserve the fossil record of Cretaceous life. Some regions became centres of fossilization, accumulating layer after layer of sediments that would preserve detailed records of ancient ecosystems. Other regions were uplifted and eroded, losing much of their fossil record to the relentless processes of geological change. In this world of inland seas and flowering meadows, of continental drift and greenhouse climates, some of the most famous predator-prey relationships in Earth's history were playing out on landscapes that seem almost surreal by modern standards. The late Cretaceous, in particular, was a time when both herbivorous and carnivorous dinosaurs reached sizes and levels of specialization that have never been matched before or since. Tyrannosaurus rex, perhaps the most famous predator in Earth's history, stalked the coastal plains of what is now Western North America during the final few million years of the Cretaceous. But T-Rex wasn't hunting in the kind of environment we might imagine. Its world was subtropical and humid, crossed by broad rivers and dotted with shallow seas. The forests it moved through were filled with flowering trees and shrubs, creating a landscape that might have seemed more like modern Louisiana than the Badlands of Montana, where its fossils are now found. The prey that T-Rex and other large theropods hunted had evolved their own spectacular defensive strategies. Triceratops developed its famous three-horned skull and bony frill, not as mere ornamentation, but as sophisticated defensive equipment. These weren't just bigger versions of modern horned animals, they were purpose-built tanks, capable of withstanding attacks from predators that outweighed modern elephants. And Kylosaurus took defensive armor to even greater extremes, evolving bony plates that covered virtually every part of its body, topped off with a tail club that could deliver bone-crushing blows to unwary predators. These weren't passive defenses. These were animals that had evolved to fight back, turning herbivory into a kind of mobile fortress warfare. But perhaps even more remarkable were the duck-billed dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs, which evolved some of the most sophisticated social behaviours known from the fossil record. These animals lived in herds that may have numbered in the thousands, migrating across vast distances following seasonal changes in vegetation. Their elaborate crests weren't just for show, they were sound-producing organs that allowed complex acoustic communication across the landscapes of the late Cretaceous. Recent discoveries have revealed that some hadrosaurs had vocal abilities that rivaled those of modern birds, capable of producing a range of sounds, from deep, resonant calls that could carry for miles to subtle variations that may have conveyed specific information about food sources, predator threats, or social status. The world these dinosaurs inhabited was one where intelligence and social cooperation were beginning to reach new levels of sophistication. Pack hunting behaviours evolved in some theropod dinosaurs, allowing smaller predators to take down prey much larger than themselves. Nesting behaviours became increasingly complex, with some dinosaur species creating elaborate nesting colonies that required coordination between dozens or hundreds of individuals. Yet even as these terrestrial ecosystems were reaching new peaks of complexity and sophistication, forces were already in motion that would bring the Mesozoic Era to a dramatic close. Volcanic activity was increasing in what is now India, beginning to pour out the massive lava flows known as the Deccan Traps. Climate was beginning to fluctuate in ways that stressed even the adaptable ecosystems of the Cretaceous greenhouse world. And somewhere in space, a mountain-sized piece of rock and metal was following an orbit that would intersect with Earth's path around the Sun, carrying with it the energy to end not just individual lives, but entire evolutionary lineages that had dominated the planet for over 160 million years. The story of the Mesozoic Era stands as one of Earth's greatest experiments in abundance, diversity, and evolutionary innovation. From the recovery following the Great Dying to the rise of flowering plants, from the giants of the inland seas to the complex social behaviours of late Cretaceous dinosaurs. This era shows us what's possible when a planet commits fully to supporting life in all its myriad forms. But every chapter must eventually come to an end, and the ending of the Mesozoic would be as dramatic as anything in Earth's long history. In our next journey through deep time, we'll explore that ending and its aftermath, discovering how catastrophe once again became the seed of new beginnings. The Day the Dinosaurs Died, Earth's Greatest Reset, sleep documentary. But even as these magnificent creatures were writing their stories across the landscapes of the late Cretaceous, the planet itself was beginning to compose what would become the most dramatic finale in the history of complex life. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe that arrived without warning. The signs had been building for millions of years, written in the language of volcanic ash and shifting sea levels, in the gradual cooling of what had been an endlessly warm world. The Deccan Traps, those massive volcanic outpourings in what is now India, had been erupting episodically for nearly 1 million years before the more famous asteroid impact that would end the Mesozoic. These weren't the explosive, mountain-building eruptions we typically imagine when we think of volcanoes. These were flood basalts, eruptions that poured lava across the landscape like slow-moving rivers of molten rock, covering areas the size of entire countries with layers of basalt that in some places reached thicknesses of over 1 mile. The gases released by these eruptions, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, ash particles, were gradually changing the composition of Earth's atmosphere. The greenhouse warmth that had characterized the Cretaceous was beginning to fluctuate in ways that stressed even the most adaptable ecosystems. Sea levels, which had remained high and stable for tens of millions of years, began to drop as the planet entered a period of slow cooling. These changes weren't happening on timescales that individual organisms could perceive. A triceratops living through this period wouldn't have noticed the world growing subtly cooler from year to year, wouldn't have seen the gradual retreat of the inland seas that had defined geography for so long. But over the spans of generations, over the deep time that measures evolutionary change, the effects were becoming profound. Species that had thrived in the stable warmth of the mid-Cretaceous found themselves facing new challenges. Food webs that had been finely tuned to specific temperature and precipitation patterns began to show signs of stress. The great diversity that had characterized Cretaceous ecosystems began to contract as environmental conditions became less predictable. And yet, life continued to innovate even as these pressures mounted. Some of the most sophisticated dinosaur behaviors we know of evolved during these final 1 million years of the Mesozoic. Parental care became increasingly complex, with evidence of dinosaurs that not only built elaborate nests, but may have taught their young the skills needed for survival in an increasingly challenging world. The marine ecosystems were perhaps showing the clearest signs of stress. The great marine reptiles that had ruled the inland seas for so long were beginning to decline in diversity, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the gradual process of environmental change, outpacing the ability of highly specialized organisms to adapt. Then, on what began as an ordinary day roughly 66 million years ago, the sky above the Yucatan Peninsula brightened with a light more intense than 1,000 suns. An asteroid, perhaps 6 miles in diameter, travelling at speeds that challenge human comprehension, struck Earth with the force of billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. But the impact itself was only the beginning. The explosion vaporized both the asteroid and the bedrock it struck, hurling millions of tons of debris into the atmosphere at velocities that carried them beyond the edge of space itself. This wasn't simply a very large explosion. It was an event that temporarily redefined the boundary between Earth and the cosmos, creating a brief moment when pieces of our planet hung weightless in the void before falling back as a global rain of molten rock. Within hours, the entire planet was experiencing effects that would have seemed like the end of the world to any observer. The debris falling from space heated the atmosphere to temperatures that ignited fires across entire continents. Forests that had grown for millions of years were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The sky itself became a furnace, killing any large animal that couldn't find shelter, underground or underwater. But perhaps even more devastating than the immediate effects was what came next. The fine particles suspended in the atmosphere blocked sunlight for months, possibly years. Photosynthesis ceased across most of the planet. The bottom of food webs collapsed, and the effects rippled upward through every ecosystem on Earth. In the darkness that followed, the great age of reptiles came to an end. Not just the famous dinosaurs, but the marine reptiles that had ruled the seas, the flying reptiles that had mastered the skies, entire lineages that had shaped ecosystems for over 160 million years. It was a pruning so severe that it eliminated roughly 75% of all species on Earth. Yet even in this moment of unprecedented destruction, the seeds of recovery were already present. Small mammals that had lived in the shadows of dinosaurs for so long suddenly found themselves in a world with vast ecological niches left vacant. Birds, the only surviving dinosaur lineage, retained their mastery of the skies. And in the oceans, smaller marine organisms began the slow work of rebuilding food webs from the bottom up. What followed the Great Extinction wasn't immediate recovery. The planet that emerged from the darkness was quieter, smaller in scale, more cautious in its experiments with large body size. But it was also, in some ways, more sophisticated. The survivors were often those species that had developed the most flexible behaviours, the most efficient metabolisms, the most complex social structures. Mammals, freed from competition with dinosaurs, began an evolutionary radiation that would eventually fill every major ecological niche on land. But this wasn't a simple replacement of one dominant group with another. The mammals that inherited the post-impact world were different from their Mesozoic predecessors in fundamental ways. They were warm-blooded, capable of maintaining constant body temperatures, even in the cooler world that followed the greenhouse conditions of the Cretaceous. They invested heavily in parental care, often nursing their young for extended periods and teaching them complex behaviours. Many developed increasingly sophisticated brains, capable of learning and adapting to environmental changes within individual lifetimes, rather than waiting for evolutionary change across generations. The plant world, too, was transformed by the extinction event. While many of the flowering plants that had revolutionized terrestrial ecosystems during the Cretaceous survived the impact, they found themselves in a world where the rules of competition had changed. The vast conifer forests that had dominated many regions were replaced by more diverse plant communities, often dominated by flowering plants that could take advantage of the higher levels of carbon dioxide that persisted in the post-impact atmosphere. Grasses, which had been relatively minor components of Cretaceous ecosystems, began to expand rapidly in the more variable climate conditions that followed the extinction. These weren't the manicured lawns or agricultural fields we associate with grasses today, but vast natural grasslands that created entirely new types of ecosystems, supporting new kinds of herbivores and the predators that hunted them. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the post-Mesozoic world was the evolution of memory itself. The complex brains that developed in many mammal lineages weren't just processing immediate sensory information, they were storing experiences, learning from past events, and using that accumulated knowledge to make predictions about future challenges. This cognitive revolution was as significant as any of the physical changes that followed the Great Extinction. For the first time in Earth's history, individual organisms could learn from experiences that happened years or even decades earlier. They could recognize patterns across seasons, remember the locations of resources, and even pass learned behaviors to their offspring through teaching rather than just genetic inheritance. Birds, the surviving dinosaurs, developed their own forms of cognitive sophistication. Some species evolved the ability to use tools, to solve complex problems, and to engage in forms of communication that bordered on language. The Great Age of Instinct was giving way to an age of intelligence. In the recovering ecosystems of the early Paleogene, we can see the first hints of the world we know today. Forests that looked increasingly familiar, grasslands that supported herds of mammals in ways that echo modern savannas, and marine ecosystems where mammals were beginning their own return to the sea that would eventually produce whales and dolphins. But perhaps most remarkably, among the small warm-blooded creatures that were inheriting this post-apocalyptic world, some were developing the capacity for something unprecedented in Earth's history: the ability to wonder about their own origins, to look at the rocks beneath their feet and ask what stories they might tell, to gaze at the stars and contemplate their place in the cosmic order. The story of the Mesozoic era lives on not just in the fossils we find, but in the very structure of our modern world. The oil and natural gas that power our civilization are largely the transformed remains of Mesozoic marine organisms. The chalk cliffs of Dover, the limestone caverns of Kentucky, the coal seams of Appalachia, all of these are built from the accumulated remains of creatures that lived and died during the age of dinosaurs. But the legacy runs deeper than geology. The flowering plants that first experimented with colour and fragrance during the Cretaceous gave rise to virtually all of our modern crops, our gardens, our forests. The partnership between plants and pollinators that began during the Mesozoic continues to sustain terrestrial ecosystems today. Every time you see a bee visiting a flower, you're witnessing a relationship that was forged over 100 million years ago. The birds that sing outside your window are the direct descendants of the dinosaurs that once ruled the earth. Their songs carry forward acoustic traditions that may stretch back to the late Jurassic. Their migratory routes follow pathways that were established when the continents were in very different positions, creating navigation systems that span geological time. Even our own bodies carry traces of the Mesozoic world. The calcium in our bones may have once been part of a marine shell in the western interior seaway. The carbon in our cells may have been fixed by photosynthesis in a Cretaceous forest. We are, quite literally, made of the same elements that built the giants of the Mesozoic era. As we reach the end of our journey through the Mesozoic era, it's worth reflecting on what this deep history teaches us about the nature of time itself, about permanence and change, about the relationship between catastrophe and creativity. The world of the Mesozoic seems impossibly remote from our own, separated by spans of time that challenge human imagination. And yet, in another sense, it's intimately connected to everything we are and everything we experience. The patterns we see in Mesozoic history, the cycles of extinction and recovery, the interplay between environmental change and evolutionary innovation, the emergence of new forms of complexity from the ashes of destruction, these same patterns continue to shape our world today. Climate change, mass extinction, the rise of new technologies and new forms of social organisation, all of these echo the great themes of the Mesozoic era. Perhaps most remarkably, we find ourselves living in a moment when, for the first time in Earth's history, a species has developed the ability to understand its own deep past, to read the stories written in stone, to reconstruct worlds that vanished millions of years before the first human ancestor walked upright. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself, matter arranged in patterns complex enough to contemplate its own origins. The Mesozoic era reminds us that our planet is capable of supporting forms of life that stretch the boundaries of what seems possible. It shows us that beauty and terror, creation and destruction, innovation and extinction are not opposites but partners in the great dance of existence. It teaches us that even the most dramatic catastrophes can become the seeds of new forms of abundance and complexity. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you some sense of the deep time that surrounds our brief moment of consciousness. Perhaps you'll feel some connection to the ancient seas where giants once swam, to the forests where the first flowers bloomed, to the skies where pterosaurs soared on wings that spanned the width of small aircraft. And perhaps in your dreams, you'll visit that world of endless summer, where the air was thick with humidity and possibility, where every sunrise illuminated landscapes that had never been seen before and would never be seen again. A world that reminds us that our own moment, however brief, is part of a story larger and stranger and more beautiful than any single imagination could contain. The Mesozoic Era ended not with a whisper, but with a bang that reset the entire trajectory of life on Earth. But what came next? How did the survivors rebuild? What new forms of consciousness emerged from the ashes of the age of reptiles? These questions lead us to our next exploration of deep time. After the asteroid, how Earth invented mammals. Sleep documentary. Rest well, fellow traveller through time. The ancient world dreams on, written in stone and starlight, waiting for other curious minds to discover its secrets. In the immediate aftermath of the asteroid impact, Earth entered what paleontologists sometimes call the quiet time. This wasn't merely the absence of the thunderous footsteps of giant dinosaurs or the calls of pterosaurs wheeling overhead. It was a deeper silence, the kind that settles over a world when entire categories of sound simply cease to exist. Imagine walking through a forest where no bird larger than a sparrow sings, where no creature weighs more than a few pounds, where the rustling in the underbrush comes only from animals small enough to hide in the palm of your hand. This was the world that emerged from the dust and darkness of the impact winter, a planet that had been, in a very real sense, miniaturized. The mammals that inherited this emptied world were not the bold, large-bodied creatures we might expect to step into such vacant ecological roles. They were cautious, small, often nocturnal animals that had learned survival through hiddenness rather than dominance. Many were no larger than modern shrews or rats, their success measured not in size or strength, but in their ability to remain invisible, to find sustenance in the margins, to reproduce quickly when opportunities arose. But within these small, seemingly insignificant creatures lay potential that the Mesozoic world had never fully allowed to express itself. Freed from the shadow of dinosaurs, mammalian evolution began to experiment with possibilities that had been constrained for over 160 million years. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with the patient persistence that characterizes life's response to opportunity. The early Paleocene world, beginning about 66 million years ago, was a place of quiet innovation. In the recovering forests, small mammals began to diversify into ecological niches that had never existed before. Some took to the trees, developing the grasping hands and keen eyesight that would eventually lead to the primate lineage. Others became more specialized ground dwellers, evolving the efficient locomotion that would give rise to the great herds of herbivores that would define later epochs. But perhaps most remarkably, some of these early mammals began to develop something that had been rare in the Mesozoic world: complex social behaviors that went beyond simple mating and territorial defense. They began to form family groups, to share information about food sources and dangers, to engage in forms of play that served to teach survival skills to their offspring. What was happening in the brains of these early post-impact mammals represents one of the most significant developments in the history of consciousness on Earth. The pressures of surviving in an unpredictable, rapidly changing world favoured not just physical adaptability, but cognitive flexibility. The ability to learn, to remember, to solve novel problems became as important as sharp teeth or swift legs. This wasn't a sudden transformation from instinct to intelligence. Rather, it was a gradual elaboration of capabilities that had existed in simpler forms throughout vertebrate evolution. But the ecological vacuum left by the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs provided an opportunity for these cognitive abilities to become central to survival strategy in ways they never had before. Consider what it means for an animal to remember the location of a food cache from one season to the next, to recognize the specific calls that indicate danger versus safety, to modify its behavior based on experiences that happened months or even years in the past. These abilities require neural architectures of remarkable sophistication, brain structures capable of storing, processing, and retrieving information across timescales that span significant portions of an individual's lifespan. The development of such capabilities wasn't merely about individual survival, it was about the emergence of culture in the biological sense, the ability of learned behaviors to be passed from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation rather than genetic inheritance alone. A mother mammal that taught her offspring which plants were safe to eat, which sounds meant danger, which roots led to water, was transmitting information that could persist across generations, creating traditions that could outlast any individual life. This cultural transmission became a new form of inheritance, one that could evolve much more rapidly than genetic change. A learned behavior that improved survival could spread through a population within a single generation, rather than requiring the slow accumulation of favourable mutations across many generations. Intelligence was becoming not just an individual advantage, but a collective one, and so our journey through the Mesozoic era draws to a quiet close, though the reverberations of this ancient world continue to pulse through every moment of our modern existence. We've travelled together across 186 million years of Earth's most audacious experiments with life, witnessing the rise of giants, the invention of flowers, the dance of continents, and the profound silence that followed the Great Reset. Perhaps what strikes you most about this deep history is not how remote it feels, but how present it remains. The oxygen you breathe was first released by photosynthesis, perfected in Mesozoic forests. The beauty that draws your eye to a flowering garden echoes partnerships forged between plants and pollinators over 100 million years ago. The very ground beneath your feet was shaped by the slow waltz of continents that began when Pangea cracked apart under Triassic skies. The Mesozoic era teaches us that catastrophe and creativity are not enemies, but dance partners in the grand choreography of existence. From the ashes of the Great Dying arose the age of dinosaurs. From the asteroid's devastating impact emerged the cognitive revolution that would eventually produce minds capable of contemplating their own cosmic heritage. Each ending became a beginning. Each silence prepared the stage for new forms of song. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you this sense of deep connection to the ancient world. You are not separate from this history. You are its continuation, its flowering, its moment of awakening consciousness. In your dreams, perhaps you'll glimpse those warm Cretaceous seas, those towering sauropods, those first tentative blooms that painted the world in colours it had never worn before,